The twin suns hung low in the sky, casting a sickly orange light over the alien market. Rows of rusted cages lined the dusty street, each one holding someone who had been thrown away by society. Some were thieves, some were debt slaves, others were simply unlucky enough to be born to the wrong people. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, metal, and cheap food sold from smoking stalls. Traders barked out their prices, shouting over one another, their voices mixing with the cries of the captives. In the middle of it all, in the smallest and dirtiest cage, sat a young alien girl. Her clothes were torn, the fabric barely holding together. Her knees were pulled to her chest, and her arms wrapped around them like she could protect herself from the stairs. Her long hair hung in a tangled curtain. Hiding her face from the world, the traders laughed as they passed her cage, calling her useless. "She's no good for work," one said loudly. "She won't last a week in the mines." Another sneered, some laughed, others spat. A few tossed spoiled scraps of food at her feet. She didn't move, not even to wipe away the spit. Her dignity had been stripped away long before this day. She had stopped expecting kindness. The only thing left in her eyes, if anyone cared to look, was a small, stubborn spark. But no one cared to look. That changed when the crowd parted slightly. A tall figure was walking slowly down the row of cages. He didn't shout, didn't barter, didn't wave coins to tempt the traders. He was humans, something rare here, something that made heads turn. His boots crunched on the dirt, and his eyes scanned the captives with a calm, steady gaze. The traders began calling to him immediately. "Human. Over here. Strong worker, cheap price. Human. This one can cook, can clean, very obedient." But he didn't stop. Not until he reached her cage. He stood there for a long moment, his shadow falling over her. She didn't look up. She had learned not to. The last time she had met someone's eyes, it had earned her a slap and 3 days without food. The trader in charge of her laughed when he saw the human's interest. "You don't want that one," he said with a smirk. "She's nothing but trouble, damaged goods. She doesn't speak much. Can't work, can't fight. Barely eats, too thin to be worth feeding." The man's tone shifted into mockery. "If you want someone pretty, she's not it anymore." The crowd laughed again, some shaking their heads at the idea. The human didn't laugh. He crouched down so he was eye level with her. Through the curtain of her hair, he could see her hands thin, trembling slightly, but her grip on her knees was tight. She was still holding herself together. Piece by piece, he tilted his head, studying her face in the dim light. Then, without looking away, he asked the trader, "How much?" The trader blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. You want this one?" he said. His voice caught between disbelief and amusement. "Yes," the human replied simply. The trader chuckled, shaking his head. "You're wasting your money, human. But if you insist, 5 credits." It was less than the price of a decent meal. The trader had given up on ever selling her, and any coin was better than nothing. The human reached into his pack and tossed a small pouch of coins onto the table. The trader counted them quickly, grinning. "Your loss," he said, unlocking the cage. The girl flinched at the sound of the metal turning. Chains were unclipped from her wrists and ankles. The skin beneath was raw and rubbed thin from months of wear. "Out," the trader barked. She didn't move at first, her mind unable to process that the order wasn't leading to punishment. The human stepped closer, extending a hand not to grab, but to help. She stared at it like it was a trap when she didn't take it. He didn't force her. Instead, he stepped back and said quietly, "You're free to walk out. Or stay here and rot, your choice." The market had gone quieter now. People were watching with curiosity, some with disgust. Slowly, her bare feet slid across the cage floor. She stood on unsteady legs. The first steps outside in months making her knees weak. She followed him, head down, every muscle ready to run if this was a trick. The crowd's whispers followed them out of the market. She won't last the week. Humans are strange. Throwing away good money like that, she'll be back. In chains soon enough. But the human didn't look back. He kept walking, his pace steady. And though the girl didn't understand why, something about the way he moved calm, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world, made her wonder, for the first time in a long time, if maybe, just maybe, she was walking toward something. Other than another cage, the sun was dipping lower when they reached the edge of the market. The noise faded behind them, replaced by the sound of their footsteps on the dusty road. The alien girl still kept her head down, afraid to meet the human's eyes. Her bare feet felt every sharp stone, but she didn't complain. She had learned long ago that speaking without permission could bring pain. The human walked a few paces. Ahead, his pack slung over one shoulder. He didn't speak either, but his pace was steady, not too fast to leave her behind. He never looked over his shoulder to see if she was following, yet somehow she knew he was aware of her every move. Behind them, back in the market. A few traders stood in small groups, whispering and laughing. One of them, the man who had sold her, leaned on the gate and shook his head. "That human will regret it," he muttered. "She's nothing but a burden," another replied. To them, the transaction was over, but to her, it felt like something strange had begun. Her mind turned over the events of the last hour again and again. No one had ever chosen her before. No one had looked at her and decided she was worth even a coin. And yet, this human had given 5 credits. Without hesitation. Why? It had to be for some reason. Maybe he had needs like other buyers. Maybe he wanted a servant who wouldn't talk back. Maybe it was all a cruel joke. The road curved away from the market and into open plains. The wind here was cooler, carrying the smell of grass instead of dust. Her shoulders loosened slightly, though her hands still clung to the edge of her torn sleeves. Every few steps, she risked a quick glance at him. He walked with the calm of someone who wasn't afraid. That was strange to her. Most people moved fast, as if scared the world would take something from them. After a while, he slowed down. "Okay," matching her pace completely. "You're limping," he said without looking at her. She froze, unsure how to answer. He glanced back, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Your feet are cut." Her instinct was to hide them behind the ragged hem of her dress. "It's fine," she muttered, her voice hoarse from disuse. He stopped walking, swung his pack around, and pulled out a strip of cloth. Without a word, he crouched, motioning for her to sit. She hesitated, but something in his tone, calm, not commanding, made her obey. He wrapped the cloth gently around her foot. Then the other. The pressure was firm, but not rough. She stared at him, trying to figure out what game he was playing. When he finished, he stood and said, "We'll reach a rest stop before dark." That was it. No lecture, no insult, no demand for thanks. They walked on, the silence between them strange but not heavy. Her mind kept returning to the moment he had crouched in front of her. Not as a master to a slave, but like someone who actually cared if she bled. The path ahead split in two, one road leading to the main settlement, the other veering into the hills. He took the hill road without hesitation. She almost asked why, but bit her tongue. When the sun finally touched the horizon, they came to a small, half-broken building made of stone. It looked abandoned. The roof patched with old metal sheets. Inside was a single bench, a cold fire pit, and the smell of dust. "This'll do for tonight," he said. Setting down his pack, she stood near the doorway, unsure if she was allowed inside. When he noticed, he frowned slightly. "You planning to sleep standing up?" She stepped inside slowly, feeling the strange safety of walls without bars. He pulled out a small bundle of food, dried meat and hard bread. When he offered her a piece, she froze. staring at it like it was a trick. "Take it," he said, simply. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, and she quickly pulled away. She ate in small bites. Used to making food last. He didn't watch her. He busied himself with making a small fire from the dry wood stacked in the corner, when night fully fell. The fire's light painted the walls with shifting shadows. She sat across from him, feeling the warmth seep into her bones. For a long time, neither spoke. Then, finally, she asked, her voice quiet, "Why? Me?" His head lifted slightly, his eyes meeting hers. She almost looked away, but something in his gaze held her still. "Because I saw you," he said simply. The answer confused her. "Others saw me," she muttered. "They saw a thing." He replied, his tone steady. "I saw a person." Her chest tightened, a strange ache spreading through her. She didn't know why those words made her want to cry, but she turned her face away, staring into the fire so he wouldn't see. He didn't push her to speak again. They sat in silence. The crackle of the fire filling the space between them, outside. The wind howled across the hills, but inside, the air felt still. And for the first time in months, she thought that maybe she could sleep without fear. She didn't know who he was or what he truly wanted. But one thing was certain, he had taken her from that cage, and for now, that was enough. Morning came with a pale, cold light creeping into the broken stone shelter. The girl woke first, curled tightly under the thin blanket he had given her the night before. Her body felt heavy. But for the first time in a long while, she had slept. Without waking in fear, she stayed still. Listening to the steady sound of his breathing, the human was leaning against the wall. Eyes closed, arms crossed, she realized he hadn't really slept. He'd stayed alert through the night. When he noticed her watching, he nodded toward the fire pit. "Eat," he said. Sliding a small packet of food toward her, she hesitated, her fingers brushing the dry bread and fruit inside. The last time someone had given her food without taking something in return was never. She took small bites, chewing slowly. Watching him as he packed his things, they left the shelter as the sun climbed higher. The road ahead stretched between rolling hills, the grass swaying in the breeze. It should have felt open, free. But to her, the space felt strange. She was used to tight places, cages, alleys, storage rooms out here. There was nowhere to hide. Still, she followed him. Her bare feet wrapped in the cloth he had tied. Each step was lighter than the day. Before, he didn't speak much, and she didn't either. The silence wasn't the heavy, cruel silence of the market. It was different. Sometimes she caught him glancing back, checking if she was keeping up. Other times, he would slow his pace without a word. It confused her. No one adjusted themselves for her comfort before. The road dipped into a small forest, the air cooler under the shade of the tall trees. Bird-like creatures with bright feathers hopped between branches, calling to each other. Her eyes followed them, and for a moment, she forgot to be afraid. The human noticed and slowed, letting her walk beside him. He didn't comment, but she thought she saw the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth. By midday, they reached a stream. The water was clear, running over smooth stones without being told. She knelt and cupped her hands to drink. The cold water stung her dry throat, but tasted better than anything she'd had in months. When she glanced at him, he was filling a metal flask. He caught her looking and simply said, "We'll follow the stream for a while, it's safer." That word safer code in her mind. Did he mean safer for him, or for her? She didn't ask, but her steps grew steadier as they walked along the water's edge. The day passed in this quiet rhythm. Sometimes they walked in silence. Sometimes he would point out something small, a type of berry she could eat, a bird whose call meant rain was coming. She realized he was teaching her without saying it out loud. When the sun began to dip again, they stopped near a cluster of rocks. It wasn't a real shelter, but it was enough to block the wind. He set down his pack and began gathering dry wood. Without thinking, she joined him. Searching the ground for sticks, she half expected him to tell her she was doing it wrong. But instead, he just nodded in approval. That small gesture warmed her more than the fire they built later, as the flames flickered, painting his face in orange light. She studied him more closely. His skin was weathered from travel, his hands calloused. He didn't carry himself like the rich traders or the cruel guards from the market. There was a stillness in him, but also a readiness, like he could move fast if danger came. Her thoughts kept circling back to the question she hadn't asked since last night. Why had he taken her? Every time she thought about it, her mind filled with possible answers, none of them safe. But then she would remember the way he wrapped her feet. The way he gave her space instead of crowding her. The way he didn't look at her like a thing. To be owned, the silence stretched between them again. Not uncomfortable, but full of unspoken questions. Finally, she broke it. "You don't want me to serve you?" She asked quietly. He looked up from the fire, one brow lifting slightly. "I didn't buy you to serve me," he said. Her brow furrowed. "Then? Why?" He tossed a small branch into the fire, watching the sparks rise. "Because you were in a cage," he said simply. Her lips parted, but no words came. No one had ever explained an action with such plain truth. It made no sense, and yet it made perfect sense. She didn't know how to answer, so she didn't. She just pulled the blanket around her shoulders and leaned closer to the fire. That night, as she drifted into sleep, the sound of the stream and the warmth of the flames wrapped around her, her last thought before darkness took her was that maybe, just maybe, this road they were walking didn't lead to another prison. Maybe it was leading somewhere she had never been before, somewhere she could actually breathe. The wind carried a sharp chill that night, cutting through the trees and making the fire sputter. The girl sat with her knees drawn up, trying not to shiver. Her thin blanket was no match for the cold. She had been cold before, so cold that her fingers had gone numb, so cold that her bones had ached, but she never asked for warmth in her old life. Asking only brought mockery. Or worse, across the fire the human sat sharpening a short blade. The sound of metal on stone, soft and steady. His eyes flicked to her for a brief moment, then back to the blade. He didn't say anything, but after a few minutes, he reached into his pack. He pulled out a thick wool blanket and tossed it across the fire toward her. It landed in her lap with a heavy thump. She blinked down at it, unsure if this was some kind of test. When she didn't move, he spoke, his voice calm. "Use it or you'll freeze." Her fingers brushed. The fabric kit was warm from where it had been near his pack. Still, she hesitated. "Why?" she asked quietly. He looked at her like he didn't understand the question. "Because you're cold," he said simply. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of hidden meaning. There was none. Slowly, she pulled the blanket around her shoulders, the warmth seeping into her skin. The firelight caught her eyes for the first time, making the faint shimmer of gold in them visible. They were beautiful eyes, though she didn't know it. She kept glancing at him, wondering if he had noticed, but his attention was on the fire. After a while, she spoke again. "They said I was worthless," she murmured, almost to herself. His gaze lifted to hers. "They were wrong." The words were simple, but they hit her like a stone to the chest. No one had ever said that before, not without wanting something in return. She opened her mouth to argue, but something in his steady eyes stopped her. The silence that followed was not heavy this time. It felt strange, but not unpleasant. For the first time in years, she felt like maybe her voice mattered later. When they lay down to sleep, he on one side of the fire, she on the other, the blanket he had given her kept her warm enough that her body relaxed fully. She closed her eyes, and this time, sleep came quickly. She didn't dream of cages or of laughter that cut like knives. Instead, she dreamed of walking on an endless road under an open sky. Morning came with frost on the grass. She sat up. The wool still wrapped around her. He was already awake, crouched near the fire, heating water in a small metal pot. He handed her a steaming cup. "What is it?" she asked, sniffing at the strange scent. "Tea," he replied. She took a cautious sip, was bitter, but it warmed her throat. She drank slowly, letting the heat spread through her chest. They set off again, the sun climbing higher. She found herself walking closer to him than before, not beside him exactly, but not trailing far behind either. Once, their hands brushed when they stepped over the same rock. She jerked her hand back instinctively. He didn't react, didn't even look at her. That was new. Most men would have used that moment to touch her again, to remind her she had no choice, but he didn't. And that quiet absence of greed was more powerful than any promise he could have made. By midday, they reached a narrow pass between two hills. A cold wind funneled through, whipping her hair into her face. She tried to keep up, but the ground was uneven and her legs still weak. He glanced back once, slowing until she caught up. "You'll get stronger," he said, as if it was simply a fact, not if but will. The certainty in his tone startled her. No one had ever spoken of her future like it was something solid. She didn't answer, but her chest felt strangely warm. That evening, they camped near a fallen tree, the trunk blocking most of the wind. While he gathered firewood, she sat watching the sky turn from gold to deep blue. When he returned, she asked softly, "Why are you kind to me?" He paused, setting the wood down. "You think kindness needs a reason?" She looked at him, her brow furrowed. "In my life, it always has," she said. He studied her for a moment, then shook his head. "Not this time." She turned her gaze back to the fire, her thoughts tangled. She didn't understand him, this human who had taken her from the market, yet treated her like she wasn't a burden. But as the flames crackled and the stars came out, she felt the smallest fragile thing take root inside her. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the start of something close. And though she didn't realize it, that night was the first time she truly began to trust. The sun was high when they left their camp the next morning. The girl walked a little closer than she used to, still wrapped in the wool blanket he had given her at night. The air was crisp, the sky a deep blue, and for a while, the only sound was the crunch of their boots and the distant call of birds. She had almost begun to believe that the world outside the market was quiet and safe. Almost. It happened when they reached a narrow stretch of road bordered by jagged rocks. The shadows from the cliffs fell across the path, making it feel colder. The human slowed, his eyes scanning the terrain. The girl noticed the shift in his body. He was still walking, but his shoulders were tighter, his steps quieter. Something was wrong then. From behind a rock outcropping, a figure stepped into their path. He was broad-shouldered, with a scar running from his jaw to his ear. Two more figures emerged from the other side of the road, blocking their way. Her breath caught. She knew these faces. They were the same men who had stood near her cage in the market. The ones who had laughed and called her names. Her legs trembled. Well. The scarred man drawled, his eyes sliding over to her. "Didn't think we'd see you again, little cage rat." The second man grinned, showing broken teeth, and with a human, too. "What did you do, human? Trade for her, or just take her?" The third man laughed. "Bet he don't know what she's worth." Nothing. The human didn't move, didn't even reach for his weapon yet. "She's not yours," he said evenly. The scarred man's smile faded. "Not yours either, stranger," he growled. "We saw her first. And if you're smart, you'll hand her over." The girl froze, her heart pounding. She knew how this would go. She had seen it before. The strong took what they wanted, and no one stopped them. She looked up at the human, waiting for him to shove her forward to avoid trouble. Instead, he stepped between her and the men. "Walk away," he said quietly. The broken-toothed man snorted. "Or what?" The human's eyes narrowed slightly. "Or you won't walk away at all." The first punch came fast. One of the men lunged forward, swinging a heavy fist. The human sidestepped, catching the man's arm and driving an elbow into his ribs. The sound of the impact made the girl flinch. The man staggered back, coughing. But the others moved in. What followed was quick, brutal, and without wasted movement. The human fought like someone who had done this many times before. He didn't shout or curse, he was silent. His focus absolute. One man went down with a sharp strike to the temple. Another stumbled away, holding a bleeding lip. The scarred man tried to tackle him, but the human twisted, sending him crashing to the ground. It was over in less than a minute. The men scrambled to their feet, muttering threats, but none dared to come closer. Not worth it. The broken-toothed one spat, and they disappeared back into the rocks. The human watched until they were gone, then turned to her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. She shook her head quickly, her voice caught in her throat. He gave a single nod and started walking again, for a moment. She didn't move. She was still processing what had just happened. No one had ever stood between her and danger before. No one had ever looked at men like that and told them to walk away. And no one had ever fought for her without expecting something in return. Her legs felt weak as she hurried to catch up to him. "Why? Why did you do that?" she asked. He glanced at her. "Because they were in our way." She frowned. "Not just that," she said softly. He didn't answer right away, then finally said, "Because you're under my protection now." Her chest tightened at the words, simple. But they carried a weight she didn't know how to hold. They walked in silence after that, the sound of the wind filling the space between them. She kept replaying the fight in her mind, the way he had moved, calm, unshaken. Like the outcome had never been in doubt. The fear she'd felt was still there, but it was smaller now, pushed back by something else, something that felt dangerously close to trust. By the time they reached a small grove of trees to camp for the night, the sun was low. He built the fire while she sat nearby, her eyes drawn to him again and again. When the flames were steady, she finally said, "They'll come back, maybe," he replied. "And if they do?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then I'll stop them again that night." As she lay under the blanket he had given her, she realized that she wasn't just walking away from her past. She was walking beside someone who wouldn't let it take her back, and for the first time since she'd been freed from the cage, she felt safe enough to close her eyes without fear of what the next day might bring. The days after the fight passed quietly. The road wound through open plains, scattered trees, and streams that shimmered under the sun. The girl walked with her head a little higher now, her steps steadier. Something had shifted in her. She still stayed close to him, but her eyes no longer searched every shadow for danger. It was as if the fight with those men had taken some of her fear and crushed it. The human didn't talk much, but he began to teach her things. He showed her how to find clean water by watching where certain plants grew. He taught her how to spot animal tracks and which ones to avoid. At first, she only watched him, afraid to try, but one morning while they were near a stream, she surprised him by pointing to a set of prints in the mud. "Deer," she guessed. He glanced at them and gave a small nod. Her lips twitched in something close to a smile, though she quickly looked away. Every evening when they made camp, he would give her small tasks, gathering firewood, setting out the bedrolls, keeping the fire steady. She wasn't used to being trusted with anything. At first, she expected him to scold her if she made a mistake. But when she burned the first batch of bread they tried to cook, he only said, "Now you know how long is too long." No anger, no insults, just another lesson. One afternoon, a sudden storm rolled in. The wind tore at their clothes and rain hammered down. Soaking the ground into mud, they found shelter under a rocky overhang. Her teeth chattered as she wrung water from her hair. Without a word, he pulled off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth and weight of it made her throat tighten. "You'll freeze," she said quietly. "I've been colder," he replied, his tone calm. She didn't know how to answer, so she kept the jacket wrapped tight around herself. When the rain eased, they continued walking. The air smelled fresh. The sky a brilliant silver blue where the clouds had torn open. She caught herself humming softly a sound she hadn't made in years. He glanced at her but said nothing, though she thought she saw the faintest curve of a smile on his lips. That night, the fire burned brighter than usual. She sat across from him, tracing shapes in the dirt with a stick. Her voice was quiet when she asked, "Why do you keep teaching me?" "Because you'll need to know," he said without hesitation. "What if I'm never alone again?" she asked, her tone almost challenging. "Then you'll still know," he replied. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She didn't understand everything about him. But one thing was clear, he wasn't preparing her to depend on him forever. He was preparing her to survive. The next day, they crossed paths with a small merchant caravan. 3 wagons loaded with goods, pulled by sturdy beasts. The merchants eyed her warily, their gazes lingering on the ragged clothes and bare feet. Old habits made her shrink back, half hiding behind him, but he didn't step in front of her. He simply stood beside her, letting her face their stares when one merchant muttered something about market scraps. She felt the familiar sting of shame. Before she could drop her gaze, the human spoke. "She's not for trade." His voice calm but sharp. The merchant's eyes widened slightly, and he looked away. Her chest swelled with something she didn't have a name for. It wasn't just safety, it was being seen as more than what they thought she was. That evening, after the caravan had gone and they had made camp near a grove, she spoke. "When I was in the cage, I used to dream about someone coming to take me out," she admitted, his eyes lifted from the fire, listening. "But in the dream, I was always the same, still small, still weak." She hesitated, glancing at him now. "I don't feel the same." He nodded once, like he already knew. "You're stronger than you think," he said, her lips pressed together, holding back a smile. She wasn't ready to show. The next few days felt different. She started taking longer strides, keeping pace with him without slowing him down. When he handed her a small knife and told her to keep it with her, she didn't argue. She practiced holding it. Remembering how he had moved in the fight, she still wasn't ready to face danger alone. But the thought of being helpless no longer felt permanent. One night, as the fire burned low, she finally asked the question that had been growing inside her. "Why did you take me that day?" "You could have chosen anyone." He looked at her for a moment before answering. "I saw someone who still had a spark," he said. "Even if you didn't see it yourself." Her throat tightened, and she looked away, not trusting her voice. The blanket around her shoulders felt heavier somehow, not from weight, but from the meaning behind his words. As they lay down to rest, the sky above them was full of stars. She stared up at them, feeling small, but no longer invisible. The road ahead was still long, and she didn't know where it would lead. But she knew one thing: she was not the same girl who had sat in that cage with her head down. And the human who had taken her from that place had given her something more than safety. He had given her the chance to stand. The first sight of the settlement came just after midday. The road curved around a low hill, and there it was, a cluster of small houses with smoking chimneys. A few market stalls and the distant sound of children laughing. The girl slowed her steps, her chest tightening. For months, her world had been cages, empty roads, and campfires under open skies. The idea of walking into a place full of strangers felt strange, dangerous. The human noticed her hesitation. "You'll be fine," he said, not as comfort, but as fact. She nodded, though her hands tightened around the wool blanket still draped over her shoulders. It was the only thing she owned now. Well, that and the small knife he had given her, 2 things more valuable than all the coins in the galaxy, because they were hers as they entered the settlement. Heads turned, humans and other species alike glanced at them, curiosity in their eyes. Some looked at her with suspicion, some with faint pity. Her instinct was to shrink behind him, but she forced herself to keep pace. She had walked roads with him for weeks. She could walk through this place too. They passed a baker's shop. The smell of fresh bread filling the air, her stomach growled softly, and she quickly looked away. Embarrassed, he noticed, but said nothing. Instead, steering them toward the small inn at the end of the street. Inside, the air was warm, the walls lined with old wooden beams. The innkeeper, a round man with kind eyes, glanced between them. "Room for 2?" he asked. "Yes," the human replied, sliding a few coins across the counter. No mention of her status, no explanation, just room for 2, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. When they reached the room, it was small but clean. Single bed, a narrow table, and a window that looked out over the street. She stood near the doorway, unsure if she was supposed to sit, stand, or wait for orders. He placed his pack down and said, "Rest, we'll get food later." She moved slowly to the chair by the table, her fingers brushing the smooth wood. It was the first real piece of furniture she'd touched in years without fear of being told to move. Later, they sat together. In the small inn dining hall, he ordered a simple meal, bread, stew, and tea. When the food arrived, she hesitated, waiting for him to take the first bite. But he pushed the bread toward her. "Eat," he said. She did, the warm bread soft against her tongue, the stew rich and filling. Halfway through the meal, she realized she wasn't thinking about whether she deserved it, she was just eating. Over the next few days, she began to learn the rhythms of the settlement. She helped the innkeeper's wife with small chores, carrying firewood, fetching water, sweeping the floors. No one ordered her to do these things. She offered. It felt strange at first, working without fear of punishment, but each small task made her feel steadier. At night, she and the human would share quiet meals, sometimes talking, sometimes not. She began to understand that silence didn't always mean distance, it could mean comfort. 2. One evening, as they returned from the market, a group of young boys ran past, laughing and shouting. One tripped, sending a basket of apples tumbling to the ground. Without thinking, she knelt and began gathering them. The boy smiled shyly and whispered, "Thank you," before running to catch up with his friends. She froze for a moment, the sound of those words echoing in her mind. She had heard many voices in her life, but kindness from a stranger still felt new. When she looked up, the human was watching her. "You're fitting in," he said. Her lips curved into the smallest smile. "Maybe," she replied. A week later, while they were sitting by the inn's fireplace, she finally asked the question that had been growing inside her since the day he bought her. "What do I look like to you?" He looked at her for a long moment. "To me," he asked. She nodded. "You're not what they called you," he said slowly. "You're not a slave, not a burden, not broken." Her throat tightened. "Then what am I?" His voice was steady when he answered, "You're you." It was the simplest thing he could have said, but it unraveled something deep inside her. She didn't cry, not here. Not now, but her chest ached in a way that felt almost good, as if something inside her was finally beginning to heal. Weeks passed, and the settlement no longer felt like a place she didn't belong. The stares faded, replaced by nods of recognition. From shopkeepers and passing travelers, she still wore the same wool blanket at night, still carried the knife he'd given her. But she also carried something new, an unshakable certainty that she was more than the girl in the cage. And every time she caught the human watching her with that same calm, steady gaze, she was reminded of the moment everything had changed. She had been cast aside, stripped of dignity, but he had seen more than what the world told him to see. And now, when she looked at her reflection in the small window at night, she didn't see just an alien girl anymore. She saw someone who had walked out of a cage and into her own life. Someone worth protecting, someone worth being.